There are things you should never tell a man, not because they're too harsh, but because once said, you lose control over how he hears them and how he sees you after. Words have weight. Some shift the balance. Some break it. You may mean honesty, vulnerability, even love, but he may hear judgment, disappointment, rejection. And once that shift happens, it's quiet, subtle, but real. He won't pull away loudly. He'll just stop leaning in. Hi, it's Vernon again. In today's video, I'll tell you 5 things you should never say to a man. Not because he's fragile, but because once trust is shaken, love has nowhere to land. If this kind of wisdom speaks to you, go ahead, like, share, and subscribe to my channel. It may be the quiet nudge someone else needs, or the truth you'll want to return to someday. Stay with me for a moment, because what comes next might change how you speak to the man beside you before the distance becomes something neither of you knows how to cross. 1. You're not enough. You may never use those exact words, but they slip out in other forms. Why can't you be more like him? You never step up. I can't rely on you. What a man hears in those moments isn't feedback, it's failure. Not a failure of action, but of identity. You're not pointing out something he did, you're questioning who he is. You see, to most men, being enough is not about perfection. It's about being respected in the eyes of the woman they love. When that respect fades, or even seems to, something inside begins to fracture. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But for many men, the greater fear lies not in confronting who they are, but in sensing that the woman they love has already made her judgment, that her gaze, once filled with admiration, now sees him as lacking. Because for a man, love is not only received, it is proven. And if the one person he hopes to prove himself to no longer believes in him, it creates a fracture deeper than failure. It threatens his reason for trying. That is the hidden cost of careless words. They don't just express how you feel. They can quietly rewrite how you believe you see him. And once that image changes, it's hard to return to the softness that intimacy requires. Modern culture often tells women to speak their truth, and they should. But wisdom knows how truth is offered matters. Truth can be a bridge or a blade. And here's the deeper part. Sometimes, when you say a man isn't enough, what you're really expressing is your own weariness, your own unmet needs. But instead of reaching for closeness, you reach for control. When a man senses that shift from intimacy to evaluation, he starts living not in connection, but in performance. And no one can love fully while being measured. So what's the alternative? Speak to his strength, not his shortcomings. Tell him when he makes you feel safe. Tell him when his steadiness holds you together. Remind him that even when he falls short, he is still seen and wanted. Because if you strip away a man's sense of being enough, what remains isn't growth, it's shame. And shame never brings a man closer. Let's keep going, because the next one often hides in plain sight. It doesn't sound cruel, but it slowly erodes something vital. A man's sense of being truly wanted. 2. I don't need you. Now, that might sound like strength, and sometimes it's meant that way. You've survived, raised kids, built a life. You've done the hard things, and maybe you can do it all alone. But here's the truth few talk about. Just because you can doesn't mean you have to say it. I remember my mother used to say that to my father, not in cruelty, but in exhaustion. She'd come home from work, juggling bills, groceries, our schoolwork, and say it under her breath, "I don't need anyone." And I watched something in my father's face change each time. Not anger, just a quiet kind of fading. Over the years, I saw him become less vocal, less present, more removed. He didn't stop loving her. He just stopped offering himself because he no longer felt invited into her world. You see, men don't just want to be loved, they want to be needed, not in a desperate, helpless way, but in the sacred, everyday way. To carry a heavy box, to fix the cabinet door, to protect you from something you didn't even see coming. When you tell a man you don't need him, you're not proving your strength. You're silencing his purpose. And purpose is where a man's love takes root. Esther Perel once said, "The challenge in modern relationships is reconciling our need for security with our hunger for independence." And it's true. You can be independent without making him feel unnecessary. You can be strong while still making space for his strength. So instead of saying, "I don't need you," try this. "I've handled this before, but I'd love your help." Or even, "It means something to me when you show up." Because what most men want isn't control, it's contribution. And when a man no longer feels like he contributes, he doesn't argue, he just exits, emotionally first, then physically. If this speaks to you, share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe you've seen this in your own life or in someone else's. Your story might be the mirror another woman needs right now. Now, stay with me, because the next one doesn't wound with words, but with silence, and it can be even harder to repair. 3. I no longer see you. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you really looked at him, not as a provider or a habit, but as a human being who still wants to be seen? Because silence can speak the loudest. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that settles between two people like dust on forgotten furniture. A silence that isn't rest, but retreat. When affection becomes automatic, when gestures go unacknowledged, when eye contact becomes a formality, a man doesn't just feel overlooked, he begins to feel erased. And here's the painful truth. Most men won't tell you this. They don't have the language for it. They'll say, "I'm fine." They'll smile at dinner. But deep down, they're living in a house where their presence feels ornamental, not essential. Imagine a fire slowly running out of oxygen. It doesn't go out in a blaze. It dims, it shrinks, and eventually it disappears. That's how men leave relationships, not always with their feet, but with their fire. In a 2021 study published by the University of Toronto, researchers found that emotional validation, simple acts of acknowledgement, was more predictive of male relationship satisfaction than conflict resolution itself. In other words, being seen matters more than being agreed with. Speak the words he thought you'd never notice. Acknowledge the effort that seems routine but was done for you. Meet his presence not with habit but with awareness. Lift your eyes from distraction and offer him your full attention, if only for a moment. These are not dramatic acts of love. They are the soft currency of presence. They are the soul's way of saying, "You still matter here." Because in the quiet patterns of daily life, love either deepens or disappears. Because when silence replaces recognition, resentment takes root quietly, and unlike an argument, it rarely offers the chance to repair. Let this be a reminder. Love dies not in explosions, but in echoes that go unanswered. Sometimes it takes just one small moment of honesty to shift the course of a relationship, even if it starts with quietly seeing what you've missed. And don't go far. The next one comes wrapped in laughter, but it leaves a bruise that lingers. 4. Never disguise disrespect as a joke. You've heard it. Maybe you've said it. A playful jab at how he loads the dishwasher. A sarcastic comment about his driving. A room full of people laughing while he stands there smiling with his mouth, but not with his eyes. On the surface, it's harmless. Just teasing, just fun. But underneath, it chips away at something men rarely speak of: dignity. Because here's the thing, men often use humor as armor, but they rarely expect to be wounded by it, especially not from the woman they love. There's a difference between laughing together and being laughed at. One builds connection, the other breeds quiet shame. And it's not about sensitivity, it's about safety. A relationship isn't just a partnership, it's a sanctuary. And when that sanctuary becomes a stage where one person is the punchline, intimacy retreats. You don't need to tiptoe. You can be playful, you can be sharp, but there is a line between wit and wounding, and love knows the difference. Because every time a man becomes the target of a joke meant to sting, even lightly, he adds another brick to the wall between you. And over time, that wall becomes a room of its own. He stops being himself around you, stops bringing his humor, his opinions, even his flaws, because he no longer feels safe to be seen. Here's something to think about. Would you say the same thing in the same tone if it were just the two of you? When humor becomes a mask for criticism, it's no longer funny. It's just disguised rejection. So let laughter lift. Let it warm. Let it remind you both of who you were when love was new. Because if a man can't laugh freely with you, he'll eventually stop laughing around you. And that's when joy leaves the room, long before he ever does. The last one is the hardest, because it's usually said when you're trying to help, but it lands like betrayal. Let's talk about that next. You should know. It usually begins with something small. A forgotten anniversary, a missed signal, a moment you wished he had read your mind. You don't say it directly. Sometimes it's just a sigh, a sharp glance, or that quiet phrase, "You should know." But here's the truth most don't say out loud. No, he shouldn't always know. Not unless you tell him.
The belief that love means knowing without asking is one of the quiet myths that unravel relationships. It sounds romantic, even noble, but in reality, it builds resentment from misunderstanding and distance from assumption. Communication isn't a test, it's a bridge, and expecting someone to cross it blindfolded only sets them up to fall. Here's the deeper truth. When we say, "you should know," what we often mean is, "I don't want to ask." We fear that if we have to explain, it loses value, that telling him what we need makes it less meaningful when he gives it. But love doesn't live in mind reading. It lives in clarity, in the courage to ask, and in the grace of being specific. A man may be strong, steady, even intuitive, but he cannot live up to a standard that's never spoken. And when he feels he's failed a test he didn't know he was taking, what dies is not just his confidence, but his will to try again. So say the thing, gently, directly, with warmth, not blame. Tell him what matters to you and why. Not to control, but to invite him closer. Because here's the real wisdom. Being known doesn't come from being guessed. It comes from being shared with, willingly, openly, again and again. And in the end, that's what most men truly want. Not to be perfect, but to be guided gently into the heart of the woman they love. Now that we've reached the end, let's take a moment to reflect on not just what shouldn't be said, but on the kind of presence, language, and honesty that keeps love alive through the years. The truth is, long-term love doesn't fade because of grand betrayals. It erodes in the slow forgetting of tenderness, of attention, of how powerful our words can be when care slips into habit. What we choose not to say matters just as much as what we do. Restraint, when guided by love, isn't repression. It's protection. It says, "I value this enough to hold it gently." Because the real wisdom isn't about silence. It's about intention. Choosing words that invite closeness, choosing pauses that allow understanding, choosing tone that opens instead of closes. In the end, every relationship becomes a reflection of the language we build it with. Will yours be shaped by correction or connection? As the poet David White once said, "The ultimate touchstone of friendship is not improvement, neither of the self nor of the other. The ultimate touchstone is witness." Perhaps that's true of love too. Not fixing, not perfecting, but standing beside someone, truly seeing them, and choosing them again through every word, every silence, every day. If something I said today gave you pause, don't keep it to yourself. Share your reflections in the comments. You never know who might need your words. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel now. Not because these truths are urgent, but because they are easy to forget, and some reminders are worth hearing again before it's too late. And I'm Vernon. Thanks for watching my video.